and welcome to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly show about finance, money, and investing. I'm your host, Ray Treverson from OTG Capital. We broadcast locally on Radio Northern Beaches and nationally around Australia on the Community Radio Network. I'm really pleased to welcome back to the microphone Frank Drenth from the Institute of Financial Professionals Australia, who was on the show earlier this year when we were talking about trusts and their rules and the 100-day ruling. Frank, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Ray. Good to be with you.
Wonderful. Now, one of the things that we're going to be talking about today are misconceptions about tax rules. And the show that we did earlier this year around trusts, I think is really useful. There's a lot of online comments about people coming back and saying, wow, I didn't realize those particular rules. And given there are hundreds of thousands of trusts out there, I'd like to thank you, I guess, from our audience that we did a really good public service there. But one of the things that is curious, you sent me this really interesting article on tradies and Utes. Now, a few years back, the Morrison government during COVID introduced an instant tax write-off. And again, people misconstrued it. And I don't know whether the Institute saw this or, as you were known back then, Tax and Super Australia, where tradies thought they were getting a cheque. Okay, so when they got this instant write-off, this tax write-off, they assumed that a tax write-off was actually cash in their pocket. And I keep, it's one of those frustrating things that when I'm dealing with people and sort of saying, no, look, a tax write-off, you actually have to expend your own money to get that tax write-off. And they think of a tax write-off as being something that's money in their pocket. And it kind of is, but it really isn't. Frank, did you see the same kind of misconceptions coming to your lines at the Institute?
Not so much, Ray. We deal mainly with our membership is mainly the registered tax agents, so they're the ones that are dispelling those myths.
so they hopefully know a lot better than the Joe Schmo on the street.
Expensing measure was a good measure. It was part of a COVID package of tax measures aimed at stimulating the economy when that was needed. But yeah, it gave you an instant write-off. It only ended a few months ago, 30 June. But yeah, it goes without saying that you only spend money on things that you really need for your business. Well, you don't go around, you spend $100 buying something you don't really need. If you get your tax back, you're still out of pocket.
Well, it's one of those funny things. You've got to spend the money to be able to get the tax write-off. And so I sit there and scratch my head. I have the same conversation when people talk to me about the benefits of loyalty programs and points. And I'm looking and going, guys, you've got to spend a lot of money to get the kind of returns, but that's for another time. I've got you on the show today because the heading of this really interesting article you recently wrote for the Institute is that Ute really exempt from fringe benefits tax. And before we get into it, I just want to read the opening paragraph because it really sets the scene very, very nicely. Recent media reports suggest the ATO may have concerns that some tradies could be taking liberties with the fringe benefits tax exemption available for utes and panel vans, where private use is claimed to be minimal. Gee, I've never heard of people taking liberties. I wonder.
No,
Utes have been selling like hotcakes for some time and are now the biggest selling new cars on the Australian market. These vehicles, the dual cabs in particular, often include features that are promoted to make them appealing for family and recreational use. But there's more to it, isn't it, Frank?
Well, yeah, potentially. And I certainly, I'm not suggesting that tradies are going around playing fast and loose with the tax rules. But if the tradie gets provided with a ute for work purposes by his boss and gets to take it home, and that's a practical way of running these things, because a lot of tradies are itinerant. They turn up at different work sites. It wouldn't make sense to travel into a central workplace first. But the private use of these cars is meant to be only very minimal, and provided that private use is only minor and frequent and irregular, there's no FBT. And that's a significant concession. But the problem is, if the boss buys the tradie a ute, gives him the keys and says, off you go, and leaves it at that, then there's a problem. even if he says to the tradie, well, you can't use it too much for private purposes, and doesn't do anything further, then that's potentially a problem.
You go on in your article, you say, if you provide vans or utes to employees principally for work-related purposes on the basis that such vehicles are exempt from the FBT because employees rarely use the vehicles for private use, then we're relying on the reduced record-keeping concession. I guess that's when things may not pass muster, as you've said in the article. So some of the conditions that for this reduced record-keeping concession, when I read through, it's quite expansive. So let's kick off. What are some of these conditions that tradies have to, and employees that employers that give that provide these vehicles for their tradies? What are some of the considerations they must start thinking about?
The first few are pretty straightforward. It's got to be a vehicle provided principally for work purposes. For most tradies, that wouldn't be a problem. It shouldn't be salary sacrifice, because it wouldn't make sense for anyone to salary sacrifice for a car that's used mainly for business use. And the GST inclusive cost has to be below the luxury car tax limit. I don't know why that rule's been included. Maybe ATO envy.
Maybe they don't want you buying a Mercedes. I mean, I was always surprised. We've got a local.
You can fork out a lot of money for a ute.
Yeah, I didn't know Mercedes made utes, but they do, and apparently you can buy. And some of these, these big ones too. Now these
the Rams go up to 150 grand.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know if they've got a spar in the back, but they might. Now, and these rules, by the way, they've all been made up by the tax office, because all the law says is minor, infrequent, and irregular private use. It doesn't expand on it. So the tax office has helpfully, I think, come up with some parameters that people can get hold of and adhere to. Now, some people will think that the parameters are a bit too tight, but they are what they are. You know what the Commissioner now regards as minor, infrequent, and irregular, and it's up to you to stick to it or not. So you've got to have a policy in place. So when you hand the keys to your employees, you've got to explain what the limits on private use are, and you've got to obtain a written assurance from the employee that they've stuck to the policy.
So what are these because the interesting thing when you use that kind of wording, and I did my degree many eons and decades ago in public policy, when you word legislation in terms like you've just mentioned, reasonable or light, or it provides a certain amount of flexibility. The tax office has, I think, sought to provide some clarity. But one of the interesting things, Frank, is that this show is listened around the community radio network around Australia, primarily in regional and remote community radio stations. Now, when you're traveling 10, 15 Ks here, for example, in Sydney, and or Melbourne, for example, 10 or 15 Ks can get you across a lot of territory, and for a tradie, that may be their entire territory. But when you're talking, anywhere beyond the Blue Mountains and out the back of Whoop Whoop, 1,000 kilometres, they could travel in a day or a couple of days quite happily and very, very easily. And so I'm just wondering, is there any scope there that suggests context becomes important, or is it fairly hard and fast?
It's completely hard and fast. There is no there's no separate recognition of people living in relatively remote areas and normally covering bigger distances. And you're right, but the rules the commissioners devise is that the private travel can't exceed 1,000 kilometres for the entire FBT year.
Wow.
And that shouldn't include a single return journey of more than 200 kilometres. You've got to travel in your dual cap ute. You've got to travel directly between home and work, and there can't be any diversion of more than 2 kilometres. So you can stop off at the shop as long as it's more or less on the way. But if it's not, then the single diversion of 4 kilometres, strictly speaking, makes you fall outside the ATO's guidelines.
Wow.
And 1,000 kilometres isn't a lot. And you think about it, you've got your cars parked behind each other in the driveway. You need to go out to the shop to get something. Are you going to shuffle the cars around so you don't use the ute for private travel? Most people will just hop in and drive and do it.
You make a really valid point, and that's where sometimes, with all intents and purposes, there's been some goodwill, I think, to provide some clarity, but I don't think it's been thought through. And I guess some of the aspects of when you provide clarity to legislation, you end up creating more of a mess than the clarity was supposed to provide. Do you think that's been the case in this instance, Frank?
Oh, look, I think people have partly relied on the fact that the tax office hasn't been rigorously policing the FBT territory, and this is a hard one for the tax office to manage, because you can't really operate on a Ford Ranger by Ford Ranger basis and try and find out how many private miles people have really done in this particular ute. That's not an efficient use of the ATO's resources. So they're hoping that the employers do the right thing and get the employees to sign the acknowledge that they know what the rules are and make a declaration every year to say that they've stuck to the 1,000 kilometre rule.
We'll talk a little bit more about declarations and some concessions, and I guess also indemnities, because I think it's important for not just the tradies that are using these company provided resources, but also the employers that are providing them, because there is some exposure that is potentially there for the employer if they don't do their homework. But look, we're just about time for a break here on Dollars and Making Sense. I'm Ray Treverson, your host from OTG Capital. I have at the microphone Frank Drenth from the Institute of Financial Professionals. It's time for a short break, and we'll be back in just a moment. Hi, and thank you for listening to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly radio program about finance, money, and investing on Radio Northern Beaches and nationally on the Community Radio Network around Australia. The views, comments, and opinions aired during our program should not be construed or viewed as financial advice. Any commentary is general advice only and does not take into account your objectives, financial situation, or needs. You should consider whether the advice is suitable for you and your personal circumstances. If in doubt, you should contact an authorised licensed financial planner. We welcome questions and feedback, and you can get in touch with us via our blog, social media channels, or email. Please search for Dollars and Making Sense in your favourite podcast platform, or check out our blog at otgcapital.com.au/blog. Hi, and welcome back to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly show about finance, money, and investing. I'm your host, Ray Treverson, and we have with us today Frank Drenth from the Institute of Financial Professionals of Australia. And today we are talking tradies and their vehicles and fringe benefits tax. Now, before we went to the break, Frank, there's a real issue that we've got to start homing in on here around this FBT and the liability if they're not doing the right thing. So we were talking about it just during the break. It's really something that we're trying to, I guess, educate. It's a public service benefit we're providing. It's the employer that's really on the hook for this, aren't they?
Absolutely. The FBT falls on the employee or the employer. And if the employee who's got the ute, it's meant to be principally for work use. If they use it to go on holidays or whatever, and they're not doing the right thing, it's the employer who's on the hook. For a $50,000 vehicle, the statutory formula gives you a taxable value of 20%, 10,000. FBT at 47%, almost $5,000 per vehicle.
So it can be quite expensive if they get it wrong. And again, that's assuming that if they've done this either with or without intent, but the tax office decides to penalise along with the tax. punitive charges can also be quite expensive sometimes if the commissioner decides to get nasty. Would I be correct in suggesting that?
There would at least be interest.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Interest as well. Yeah.
Not as much as it's a bit more than it used to be. It was very low for a while, but and there could be penalties if the employer wasn't taking the rules seriously enough and chasing up his employees.
So one of the fascinating things in reading your article that again, it just staggers me that, simple things like a tradie deciding to do the right thing by his spouse or her spouse and dropping the kids off to school could actually have them breaking the tax law, because by doing this diversion to drop the children off to school, they could actually be diverting more than 2 kilometres. And we mentioned before the break, if these people happen to live in a non-city area, the idea that you would divert more than 2 kilometres, sitting there going, yeah, so of course I would, and particularly if you're at the back of Whoop. These kind of distances are absolutely trivial. So your opportunity, I think, to break this tax law is wide and quite handsome when I think about it.
Yeah, and you're right, Ray. Certainly in regional areas, there wouldn't be many people who could get their kids to school in less than 2 k's. Although, look, I mean, the school might be 5 k's away, but if that's also on the way to the job, then it may not be that large a diversion. But the real problem is the tax office has said, if you take your kids to school, even if it's only a 2 kilometre diversion, and then you drive another 98 kilometres to cover the 100 kilometres to work. That whole 100 kilometres to work is treated as private travel.
Wow.
And not work related. So there is a special work related travel rule for these utes, and it's very worthwhile. Normally travel between home and work is private because it's something that's determined by where you live, and you're not working as you're traveling to work. So it's a very useful special rule to have, but it doesn't apply if you're not traveling alone.
I guess one of the fascinating things in your article, you point out the ATO has said it expects the employer to check the vehicle's odometer reading occasionally, just to make sure the employee hasn't been on a major boating or camping trip over a long weekend. I mean, and this brings to bear some of the things we were talking about at the beginning of the show, when you're talking about the largest selling type of vehicle in Australia. And when you think about all the commercials on the telly that feature these dual cab ads, and they feature boats being being towed all over the place. And I mean, gosh, the previous government made this huge thing about the weekend and the ute and being able to drag your trailer around the country. All of a sudden, the tax office is going, "Oh, not so fast, guys." There's a problem with that.
Yeah, and it's not just in the ads. I mean, I see dual cab utes on weekends towing a trailer loaded up with camping gear. Someone helping their mate move house. Utes are very handy. And, I know a couple of people with utes, and they help me out sometimes. I give them a beer or two, and it all works out. But it's private use by them.
So one of the things here you've highlighted in your article, seeking an indemnity, as well as obtaining a declaration from the employee, the boss might consider going one step further and asking for an indemnity for any fringe benefits tax that may be liable in respect to their private use. Now, in your experience in dealing with tax professionals day by day, week by week, Frank, do you see this as being a logical progression that the employer, the boss, is trying to give themselves a bit of, I guess, breathing space? And do you see it being employed a lot?
Look, I can't really. It's just a thought. I mean, you'd have to consider the impact that would have on employee relations.
Right,
if everybody gets on all right, that's fine. But if the employee has already signed a bit of paper saying, I've read your policy, I understand it, and then at the end of the year, he signs another bit of paper saying, yes, I've complied with it. If you're also going to require them to give you an indemnity, things could get a bit frosty.
I like that term, a bit frosty.
You know, it's something to consider if you didn't feel that employees were taking it seriously. If they were
so when the guy turns up on a Monday with mud all through the mud guards and seaweed hanging off the tow bar, and the guy says, "Oh no, boss, I didn't take it anywhere over the weekend."
And his socials are full of holiday spots.
See, again, this is the interesting thing, and this is where the tyranny of the internet, ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend but can also be your worst enemy. I really like this part of your article. Traveling to work with a family member, even just for part of the work trip, is not treated by the AT as work-related travel, as you've rightly pointed out before, Frank. But the thing is, you know, when so many people, social media posts are documenting major family holidays in distant locations while loaded up with camping gear and towing a boat. I mean, hey, I went to the Big Red Bash last year out of Birdsville, and the number of Utes that were towing caravans and all this kind of palaver. And I was sitting there looking at that, thinking of the Institute of Financial Professionals Australia. I got to tell you, because I'm thinking to myself, are these guys on a real legitimate trip? Or is this something they're saying, no, this is actual private use? I'm just wondering.
Or maybe their employer is paying FBT.
And sometimes, yeah, when you mentioned the numbers before on a $50,000 vehicle, the FBT is $5,000. Do you think, though, when you balance the kind of punitive measures that the ATO's got juxtaposed to the tax payable, and considering that some of it, you know, that you're still talking a majority of the work will hopefully be work related, would it be better just to pay the FBT?
Look, there may be a better way of ensuring against that sort of risk, and what I would consider is getting my employee to keep a 12-week logbook of their use of the vehicle. It's a pain in the rear, but because FBT is payable on the statutory formula, 20% of the cost of the car, or on the basis of your actual running costs, which are driven by your logbook. So if your logbook shows, you know, less than 5% private use for that 12-week period, then that's fine. Just don't plan any Easter holidays and other big trips during that time.
So you pick your 12-week period to make sure there's no Easter or a long weekend, depending on which state you're in, where your long weekend.
I would never advise people to manipulate the system, right?
Oh, of course not. No. We're not doing that at all. Tax avoidance is illegal. Tax minimization is okay. But yes, I totally accept that, Frank. You're absolutely right. We don't promote that on dollars and making sense at all. But I guess it's the practicalities, I think, is what we're looking at here. And I think you've made some really salient points in your article. And I guess the last one that I would like to talk about is challenging the ATO. Now, when I read this, I scratched my head, because I think you'd have to be on pretty solid ground to be challenging the tax office, because most times people lose.
Most times, but not always. There was an AAT decision about a month ago where someone managed to overturn about 14 or 15 years of ATO law, which wasn't actual real law, but just an interpretation in relation to the unpaid present entitlements of trust. But I mean, there was very big money involved there, and the risks were very high, and the AAT decision's under appeal. But I mean, if you get caught, and if the tax office takes the view that you didn't do 1,000 case, you did a 1,500 private case, and that's too much, you'd be up for FBT. Well, you pay the FBT, but then you pay a modest fee and appeal to you ask for a review at the AAT, and they might take a more lenient view of it. Mm. I mean, it's just the ATO's opinion, that's all. It's not the law.
Yeah. I guess at the end of the day, it's what's fair and what's reasonable. And I must say to you, Frank, in the times that I've ever dealt with the ATO, I had a matter to deal with them a number of years back around my SMSF. And I must say, in my dealings with the ATO, even when on personal tax, I had to ring them up and say, look, I'm going to be late because of personal circumstances. This is years ago when, you know, we had family health, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I just found that when you get on the phone and actually talk to somebody in the tax office, I found them to be perfectly reasonable. And I think as long as you explain context and aren't, I think, openly and brazenly trying to rip the system off, I have always found the tax office to be incredibly fair and reasonable to deal with.
Yeah, look, they generally are. But there are some things that they won't move on, and I suspect they're not going to give too much away where they think the private use of the users is a lot more than they've put out in their own rules. Yeah, look, the best position to get into is to show the tax office when they come and ask you about those exempt utes, to show them that you understand the rules, that you take them seriously, you've made your employees aware, you got their declaration, and you've got no reason to believe that they're false. If you can make it, if you can show that you're serious about it, they may leave things alone. But if they start digging into people's social media and check their toll records, well, that could be another issue. And I mean, the ATO sees these utes on weekends as well, and they clock it.
Of course, they're humans like you and I. Look, Frank, it's been a really fascinating discussion. We're just about out of time here. You've been listening to Frank Drent from the Institute of Financial Professionals Australia. You're here on Dollars and Making Sense. Frank, always a pleasure to have you on the show. We're out of time now. Thanks for coming along.
Thanks for having me. Great to talk. Bye, Ray.
Bye.